So this session, I'll let Evan run the panel discussion, and then I'll be with you later for the round. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we're just getting our caffeine levels right to start, which is fine. So while people get their energy liquid, I am going to just provide a little bit of context for this final plenary, which is ambitiously called Getting Everything Right. Please don't be overwhelmed by that, because really getting everything right is just about getting the next steps right. How do we get small right, make those connections? How do we adapt? How do we govern? What's happening with the blue economy? There was aquaculture discussions also. How do we move from step 0 for marine conservation? And many other themes and topics that we talked about. So actually, in addition to our 4 speakers who are going to be talking about those next steps, all of you have contributed to the conversation about getting everything right. And some evidence of that is on the back wall. And you'll see, if you look across, some really interesting tensions between slowing down, moving forward, between learning from different and interacting with different people from different fisheries. And of course, some great interventions started by the 3 wonderful scholars yesterday during the governance panel. So, as Ratana said, these 4 fantastic people are 4 gadflies today to just get us started and moving. And then we'll come back to you to talk about getting the next steps right. So our first speaker is Keith Sullivan, who was born and raised in the rural community of Calvert on the southern shore of Newfoundland and Labrador, where he fished with his father on the deck of an inshore fishing vessel until completing university. Having grown up during the cod moratorium years and gaining 2 decades worth of experience and expertise while fishing with his father, Keith has a deep understanding of how critically important adjacent resources are to coastal communities in our province. Please welcome Keith Sullivan, President of the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union, which represents over 15,000 working women and men throughout Newfoundland and Labrador.
Okay, yes, thanks very much. And I do have a presentation. I'm not sure if people are ready to go, but thanks everybody for hanging in there. Your attention after what's been 3 pretty action-packed days, and I'm sure a little bit of socializing in the evening. So congratulations for making it and with this much attention so far. And I have been called worse than a gadfly too, so we'll take it. That's not bad. That's not bad. So as Evan had said, we do represent about 15,000 people. Most are in the fishing industry, and the bulk of those people would be inshore fish harvesters, and most undoubtedly would be classified as small-scale harvesters. And the others, there's many others who rely on what those small-scale inshore harvesters catch and onshore processing. So really what's a part of that coastal economy here in the province. So you just want to let me know if I'm assuming the, no, there we go. Okay. So I'm assuming the clicker will take it from here. All right. Okay, and just quickly, I suppose, a snapshot of some of the work we do. I know it's kind of about getting things right here in the province, but kind of by way of that, I'll give some consideration to, you know, what our experience has been in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, some of the challenges we had and what we see. So some of the work we do is like collective bargaining, minimum prices, advocacy and policy work. We've developed a significant amount of science expertise and work with DFO, and some would say sometimes against, but mostly we try to work with DFO on science. The number of people we represent is really, we look at these as, small individual enterprises. Sometimes it's 2 people to a vessel, sometimes it's 5 or 6, and there's over 3,000 of them around the province. And it's really, once you get outside of this area off the Avalon Peninsula, outside St. John's, it's generally the biggest industry, the biggest employer in most of the towns. And it's really the kind of the heartbeat of most of the areas on the coast. So people do fish, whether it's from the rocks right out to, the edge of the continental shelf. And in some cases, a lot of people here wouldn't consider, 15 and 20 meter vessels necessarily small scale. But I think they have more similarities with how they're structured as owner operators and, a lot of community people operating on these boats that are more like small scale. So they're usually community people, a lot of times families on these vessels supply the product that keeps the local plants going. So I think they're more like that. And most of them are multi-species operations. So they're not just relying on one level, hitting one species. They're relying on many trophic levels. And that's added up in recent years. So we have over $800 million landed last year. I know all of our successes are not necessarily measured in the dollars and cents, and there's other measures, but at the end of it, I think it's important for people to make a good, fair wage. And I mean, that's important that the people who live and rely on the adjacent resources actually benefit from it. A lot of the reminders, I never got into all the sessions, but I've heard things about the moratorium. You'll undoubtedly hear more about it in the coming days. We're getting up to a 30-year anniversary of the infamous cod moratorium. So for those who wouldn't know, but I think I'm speaking to a pretty informed audience, at that time, 30,000 people just got thrown out of work, not sure what they were really going to do next. And that changed everybody's lives, or changed the reflection, the culture of our province. And I would say that I think we're determined, really not to be defined by that, even though we still do be defined by that a lot of times. We've had some successes, and sometimes I feel we have not learned anything from that. So people will see the picture here, and it's probably one of the most memed pictures in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador. So this happened the day before the moratorium was announced, and John Crosby, then, who's on the right, had an altercation in Bay Bulls on the wharf, and it was about to close down the fishery. People knew that. So, and he said, I didn't take the goddamn fish out of the water to this gentleman. Happens to be my father-in-law now, actually. So he shows up a whole lot. So it was pretty tight there. I was talking to people at lunch about connections in BC. There's a lot like that in Newfoundland and Labrador fishery as well. But I did get a picture of John Crosby after, by the way, from a friend in Labrador. He did have fish, and he did take it out of the water. So I got proof of that eventually. But it was at that time. Before I move on, I should say about some of the, I guess, still the misconceptions, and it takes a while for us to catch up. People still talk about, the cod. Nothing has happened to the cod since the moratorium. It's grown at, about 50 times at least. We're gone from 10,000 metric tons of northern cod to a massive stock of cod, 500,000 metric tons that we're not fishing on very much at all, a couple of percent or less. So just to put it in perspective that, okay, we want to continue to build it, but it's not as if it has not rebuilt, and we're not doing some things good. So one of the things I think in the wake of the moratorium that we started to figure out after our harvesters had pointed out that, what we're seeing is not matching up with science. There is less cod. Most people are fishing in areas close to land, not chasing fish far abroad, and they weren't seeing the migration happen the they called that out, but not much had happened. In the time after that, we developed, got more involved in science. I think there was an openness from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans after that to say, okay, I think we'll listen, and there was a start of a lot more of the co-management process. And what I've seen since is a build-up of that, and now I think less respect for harvesters, less opportunities for input, less opportunities for real co-management. It's disappointing, it's hard to explain, and maybe some of it comes with complexities of models, precautionary approaches, ecosystem-based models. But either way, it's definitely disappointing, and I think it's a common theme what we've heard from other speakers here this week. Very simply, I think a part of getting it right is, we have people who, the reason they've settled parts of this island, a lot of the places we live around the world, a lot of the coastal regions, is because of the adjacent resources, the fish. Keep it very simple. Those people should be primary beneficiaries of the resource. I find every time we get further from that, more convoluted reasons why company or corporation X, Y, and Z should get it because they're the best ones to be able to do it. They got the business plan. There's some kind of reasons. We get further from, I think, making decisions and managing our fisheries that are best for people and people in small scale and local fisheries. Also made the point there, I'm not quite following the slides, but obviously food security in these areas, it's important that people have traditionally relied on those local foods and continue to have access to it. Now, we mentioned the blue economy keeps coming up, and I kind of like some of the comments I heard earlier. It's like, what in the is that? What is it about? I've heard someone describe it. Chris, I believe a strategy to build a strategy around something. I don't know. So I keep going to places to try to be enlightened about really understanding what the blue economy is going to mean, but it still continues to be murky. But I think for us here, again, getting back to those inshore harvesters, 100% of the value of that fish comes to land, processed in the community, builds on those jobs, tens of thousands of jobs, and good paying jobs in this province, by the way, for people in those local areas. So the areas where we have fish processing facilities, they're the major employers generating tax revenue, bringing in businesses, whether you're in retail, you're supplying gear, any type of services. They are really the linchpins of the local economy. So I think we all really understand that, and I think we could have some, we've all seen all kinds of studies to demonstrate that, but in the few minutes here today, I probably don't have an opportunity to go into it too much. So one of the most important pieces of work that I think we've done since I've been with the FFAW and work with groups all across the province and across Canada, sorry, with the Canadian Independent Fish Harvester Federation has been to focus on ensuring that, legitimate inshore fishermen get access to the resource. What we saw for a long time here was there was policies around it, but fish processing companies in particular were able to get around that policy and get their hands on the resource through the back door. Now, a couple of years back, we got legislation that said that was illegal, not only as a policy. Last year, we got regulation that put some meat on the bones of that legislation, and that was great. Great celebrations were had. This was going to change the world. Here we are, more than a year later, and people still see the exact same things. This is company boat XYZ here. We all know it, but at least to us and the people who are living in those fishing communities, nothing has changed despite what we think it's positive legislation, some nice regulations. We got words on paper, but the action to back it up still hasn't happened. But we're hopeful, and we're going to continue to push to make sure that those licenses get into the hands of people who our government says very clearly should be there, and the people in our provinces and communities believe it as well. So we hope that that work continues. And directly related to that is really what we see is the biggest impediment to young people getting in the fishery now, to get into owning enterprises, I should say. You know, people can get in the fishery now relatively easily, get work as crew members and everything else. I mean, people are doing well, so it's not anybody can get there, but there's not too many challenges to that. But there are into owning licenses, and that's certainly the biggest one. We've heard about, you know, the graying of the fleet and all these terms and considerations. But while some of the demographic challenges do exist, there are people who absolutely love to fish, love this lifestyle, and are making good money at it. So we do have people who are coming behind and interested. We got to deal with some of the barriers we have, but I think there are great opportunities for that. It's a lifestyle people really, I think, more and more are striving to, everyone don't want to live in a city now necessarily, and they figure this is certainly a good job. So I think we have to focus specifically on that, and I think there's a role for government. So this is basically just to summarize in some of those main points. Really have to turn the clock back and have more harvesters' experiences and knowledge included in science and management. I've heard certainly consistently that Indigenous knowledge would come with the same considerations and challenges too. So the adjacency to resources, those closest people who historically have depended on the resources should have access to them. Whether the species composition changes in a coast, that's happening a lot with climate change. But right now on the west coast of Newfoundland, for example, we're seeing shrimp are changing, there's more redfish. So I think the consideration for government and what they've been lobbied by corporations is we should have all those shrimp harvesters and people who work in shrimp plants thrown out of work and give the licenses to offshore companies to build boats far off distant lands and come in and drag that while people on land are not doing well. That's roughly the model that others would like to see. We have to have a consideration in the blue economy. I know it's still been established and we kind of joke about what it is and is not, but the people who are going to be most impacted by developments in the marine environment are those people who live and work and live there. So, I mean, they have to have first consideration and a priority while developing that strategy. I've already talked clearly about enforcement of this owner-operator, making sure that inshore harvesters get access to the resource, and particularly future generations. And I believe we've done some work in other jurisdictions around a particular act that gives opportunities for the next generation of young harvesters. And that's an area that needs special attention as well. So just a couple of comments for me, and I hope I didn't take up too much time. No one flagged me down, so thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. And we have next steps in proposed legislation, which is fantastic. So I'm going to move quickly to our next speaker, who's now my neighbor, because I moved into her neck of the woods. And that's Kimberly Oren. Kimberly is a former high school science teacher turned commercial fisherman and co-founder of Fishing for Success, a nonprofit social enterprise in Petty Harbor that is creating a new pathway for the youth of Newfoundland and Labrador to connect with their fishing heritage. She is the lead facilitator of Project Wet Canada in Newfoundland and Labrador and serves on advisory committees for Food First NL, Farm to Cafeteria Canada, Ocean Frontier Institute, Informing Governance in a Changing Ocean, Too Big to Ignore, and volunteers all over the place, including for the Social Justice Cooperative. Kimberly was honored to be recognized as a St. John's YWCA Woman of Distinction and a TEDx speaker. Recently, Fishing for Success received Memorial University of Newfoundland's President's Award for Public Engagement Partnerships and the Sustainable Tourism Award sponsored by Parks Canada and Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Oren. Yeah, you can go from anywhere.
They always make these things for tall people. I could have just stayed and sitting. I'm always like, ooh, yay, I have people that I can talk to. Do I have 55 minutes? That's what high school teachers would do. When I heard Ken speak, I completely decided to change up what I was going to say. And so now I don't even know what I'm going to say up here. So let's see where I go. So let me put down all my accoutrements here. The first thing I brought that I wanted to share you was to talk about the fish. So this is a Gyotaku print of the codfish, and this is an actual print of an actual fish that someone caught. And it might have been their first fish on a fishing trip that they came out with, Fishing for Success, which is a nonprofit social enterprise in Petty Harbor. And our vision is that every child will learn their heritage fishing, whatever that heritage might be, and whoever their ancestors might be. And when you get really close and look at this, you can see the fin rays. And, you know, children today are afraid of living things. It's called biophobia because they spend more time on these things than they do outdoors. They spend, this is pre-COVID, you know, this is before times, they would spend 6 to 8 hours a day on these things and about 15 minutes a day outdoors. And so as a high school science teacher, that terrified me, even though I was teaching chemistry and physics or, and so then when I moved into teaching things like marine biology and I wanted to take my kids outside, I saw the impacts of this biophobia and this videophilia, this love of all things on the virtual screen. And the other thing I noticed about children's attachment to the virtual screen is that they became attached to no place and not this place that they lived in. They didn't know the living things in their backyard and the plants in their backyard. They couldn't name them. And that really worried me because that is what leads to your sense of place and your connection to place and your identity that is so important growing up. And it glues you to where you are. Growing up, my dad was in the US Navy, so I really lacked a sense of place. And I think I became very sensitive to that. What's this got to do about the fishery? Getting to that. So this is a picture of my first fish. And if I had a presentation, you'd be able to see it like from the 70s. I'm really dating myself. And it's a little tiny mud trout caught in a lake outside Gander. And my dad was not really into fishing, although when my dad went fishing, he went and caught a tuna that was like 750 pounds. He had to always outdo things. But this was my first fish. And there was a gentleman on the side of the lake and fishing. And I kept bugging him, what are you doing? What are you doing? And finally, he just like, okay, kid, go over there and get a branch. And I went and pulled a branch off of an alder tree. And he cleaned it for me, pulled all the side branches off, tied a little line to it and a hook. And I caught a little mud trout. It was better than winning the lottery. Although I can't say for sure because I've never won the lottery, but it was so amazing because you drop this hook in the water and this little worm and you pull up this beautiful, shiny, silvery living thing that's better than any jewelry. And then you can bring home a meal to your mother who's just absolutely amazed at what you've done, and you bring her this gift. And so that was it. I was hooked, pun intended. And it really secured my interest and my curiosity about the natural world around me. And so I became a really serious science nerd. Just in case you're interested, all of you fish nerds out there, this is Natalie Panick's Twitter feed. She's a space engineer. She works on the Canadian Space Arm. And she says how it got started, fishing, got her interested in science. So why are we leaving youth out? Where's the youth? Did we talk to any young people today? What do you think about fishing? Did we talk to them? So in 2017, which was in addition to the 150th birthday of Canada and the 150 let's do better than the first 150 years, we had an event where we invited young people to talk about, because it was the 25th anniversary of the cod moratorium. You know, these are all children who were born after the cod moratorium. And we asked them, what would you like to see for a future fishery? And this is the first time that young people had ever been asked about what they would want to see for a future fishery. And Donovan Taplin led the discussion. It was a youth moderator asking young people, and they all wanted to be involved. They'd rather have a first job working with fish rather than flipping hamburgers. So I think we're kind of not thinking about including them. We're underselling them or undershorting them. This is a program that we have for young people to get them out fishing because we facilitate access. And you can see this young person is climbing down a 10-foot stage head to get into a little wooden boat. And this, of course, encourages their bravery. This is a project by one of our Young Canada Summer Job student. It's the Pride Dory. And so you can see that now the place reflects what we are trying to do as a nonprofit, which is to make space for everyone in the boat. So it's pride colors on the outside, trans colors on the inside, and the gunnel and the transom of the boat are wrapped in brown and black. We partner with nonprofits to help with the transportation issue because there's a lot of barriers for people to get out into nature. And when you talk about getting out onto the ocean, there's even more barriers again. And so we partner with like-minded nonprofits, and one of them is Association for New Canadians. And here is a program that our Girls Who Fish volunteers for, and it's called WISH, Women Sharing Heritage. And this was a rainy day, otherwise we would have been outside or in the boat, and we took over the fishing shed, which you know is of course a very male space, and we spread the blankets on the floor and shared food. And the women in this program, they bring their children so that they're not worrying about where their children are for the day. And I'm showing you all of this because when you're thinking about marine spatial planning, and you've got that little widget over there that says tourism and recreational, are you envisioning this as recreational? One of the events, of course, well, many of the events, one of the partners that we have is with First Light. St. John's has got the fastest growing urban Indigenous population in Canada. And we wove withies together. And so Fishing for Success had been petitioning Department of Fisheries and Oceans for special permit to fish for cod Tuesday through Friday. You see the recreational groundfish fishery, as it's called, is only allowed to be conducted on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, July and August, and then about 9 days, the end of September and the beginning of October. Well, if you're working with nonprofits to provide access for their members to get out on the ocean and experience all of that that fishing provides, how are you going to partner with nonprofits if they have access to their members and access to staff and access to transportation? Because Petty Harbor is about 20 minutes from here. We don't have public transportation to there. And Fishing for Success is this little tiny, very poor nonprofit. I'm a volunteer, for example. So we just don't have the money to provide transportation for people. So we just have that Monday to Friday window. Now we only can fish Monday then, according to the recreational groundfish fishery dates. Now, Monday is oftentimes a holiday during the summer. So now we're down to maybe 3 or 4 days to work with providing access to this transformational experience that really can mean a lot to people. So finally last year, we were given the permit for Tuesday through Friday. And the first one that I called was Stacy House at First Light. And I said, we got it. We finally got the permit. I said, who do you want to take fishing? And I'm imagining, planning this because I'm very detailed. I want very, little particular little program. And I said, let's do this. And Stacy says, no, I want everybody to go. Everybody. And I said, okay, whoever you want, just have them call me and we'll set it up. So she calls me back and she's got this list. And she said, Kimberly, I want to tell you, when I told the Inuit elders, some of them started to cry because they hadn't been out on the water to go fishing since they moved to St. John's for social supports or medical care. So that we are denying access to many people, and we have no idea what it means to them. So that picture that I told you about, I had written a letter to my grandfather about my first fishing experience, and I have a letter right here. Back in the day when the only way you could communicate to someone was through snail mail. And so here it was, 1973, I described to my grandfather my fishing experience. And when my grandfather passed away, you go through your loved ones' items like you normally would. And, my grandfather rarely spoke about World War II, and we found all these boxes of amazing World War II pictures. But they were put in an attic up there, just packed away. And but yet this picture and this letter he had tucked away in his Bible on his nightstand. And so this picture in this letter, even though it meant something to me as a child, and I still remember my first fish, this really meant something to my grandfather, that he kept it on his bedside all those years in his Bible. So what does a first fish experience mean to a young person? And what access are we denying someone when we think of this limited view of tourism and recreation? So here's one of the young children participating in our nonprofit program. And she's got this little bag of fish. Really quickly, because I know she's just going to zoom away and tell someone else her great story. You can see her hands are just working. And I hope you can see her, really, her eyes are just lit up. And she's just like, the fish was so big. And she's just like, and I got this bag of fish and I'm taking it home to mom. And she said, mom, just like, and it just hit all the buttons with my first fish experience. And I'm going to put so much spices on it. And it's going to be a spicy dinner. It's going to be spicy and it's going to be so good. And she's just telling me how she's going to cook it and what the fish was like and all the fish she saw. And Leo helped her bring it in. And so what does this experience mean to this young girl, and how this is going to help her in the future? Like this experience for me was where I could go in bad times and recall. And this was a connection through the years to my grandfather when I lived away. fishing is a shared human heritage that all of us in this room, of course, share. But when we think about all of the cultures all around the world, ponds, lakes, rivers, streams, oceans, everyone has fished. And if it's throughout time, we've all fished. And it's just this beautiful shared human heritage. One of the ways that Fishing for Success gathers revenue, because it's very difficult to get revenue to take kids out in little boats in the North Atlantic and then give them sharp knives to, cut out cod tongues. And so taking out tourists is a really awesome way to do that. And what we find is that people from all around the world have their very own special fishing stories. Again, would you describe it as a recreational activity? So I have a problem describing to young children about killing a fish for food. I'm not going to describe that as a recreational fishery. It's a food fishery. And so I teach children about their place in the food web and where they are in the ecosystem. So I'd love to see the ecosystem-based management have humans in there, put humans in there. We're predators, we're in there. And so I talk to children about their place in the ecosystem and they're part of nature. And we have to be responsible predators and take care of this whole system. And that's what's important about fishing by hook and line or by hand line. You're handling one fish at a time. You're killing it quickly, humanely. So youth access is what we're advocating for and what I want you to remember and put into your mind and think about. So I think I'll just leave it right there for now. I have so many other things to say, but maybe they'll come up in the question session. So I thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Kimberly, for your words and for the in-person PowerPoint. You're so you managed to get around everything and do whatever you want to do, and I like that a lot. All right, so our next speaker is Kevin Anderson. Kevin is retired as the Regional Director General of Fisheries and Oceans Canada for Newfoundland and Labrador, and assumed his current position as head of School of Fisheries at the Fisheries and Marine Institute in May of 2020. Kevin is originally from Lonso Meadows, participated in a family fishing enterprise with his father and brothers. He began his career as a high school teacher and principal in coastal Labrador before joining DFO as a fishery officer in 1991. He's held many positions in DFO and taken on many files. And so I'll just move past the list is like this. For example, during his career, he was a negotiator for land claims and other Indigenous fisheries agreements in several Canadian provinces. In 2019, he was appointed by the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans Canada as an interlocutor for the transformation of the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation. Kevin has taught graduate level courses in fisheries policy resource management as a part-time instructor at the Marine Institute from 1999 to 2020. He also served as a member of the Marine Institute's Industry Advisory Committee. So we're really lucky to have Kevin with his different perspectives and different roles he's played in his career. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Anderson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. And thank you for coming to St. John's, all of you who traveled great distances. When Evan approached me to speak earlier, I assumed he was asking me to speak on a specific topic. So I took the liberty of giving him a list of the things that I may want to speak on, only to discover that was not the intent. I was to come in the last group and speak in more general terms about getting everything right. So getting everything right, I suppose at its fundamental level, is about not getting anything wrong. But what we've learned, I think, in the last 3 days is that it's much more complex than that. Right for you and wrong for me may be the very same thing. It depends on where you are, where you come from, what is your perspective, and the reality of your place, your space, your worldview. Over the last 3 days, we've learned and heard of fishing places like San Diego, the Columbia River, the coast of British Columbia, Lake Superior, other lakes, Upper Lake Melville, and Bay de Verde. All examples of very diverse places with very diverse history and very different perspectives and worldviews on what's right and what's wrong. So first of all, I would like to speak to you about what is small. In day one, we learned there were conversations about small is getting too big, what is small. It's about finding identification and definition on why we're here. To me, what is small is no longer about boat size. It's not about the technology that you use. That's evolved and changed all around the world and in very rapid order. To me, it's about the individual. Keith talked about the owner-operator, the person who owns the vessel, pursues the fishery on behalf of his or her family. It's about family, men, women, daughters, and sons. We learned a lot about how it's connected. We had speakers, daughter of a fish harvester, they fish together. We heard Tony describe fishing with his son, fishing with his father. It's about family. That family definition may vary in place and time, but ultimately it speaks a lot about what is a small-scale fish harvester. It's certainly about community. We've heard about indigenous communities, the communal perspectives. It's about communities all over the world. We continuously hear examples from New Zealand and Indonesia, British Columbia, the United States, and other places. It's about community. And ultimately, I think it's about territory. We heard about indigenous territories, a place, a sense of belonging. We know, for example, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, the inshore fisheries are often defined in bays, areas. Tony talked about out to 25 miles. That's intentional. That is his space, his counterpart's space. So that in this world where we live here, that sense of space in fishing space is very much part of the definition. When you move further afield, go into other areas, you're less likely to associate yourself with small scale, whether you meet the DFO definition or not of 65 feet or 90 feet here, it doesn't matter. So it's about, again, I'll say it, it's the individual, it's about family, it's about community, and it's about territory. We also heard a lot about sharing allocation systems, the idea of quota. What does that mean? We skate around the issue that some of us are talking about who owns the fish. We've heard a lot about how inaccurate and inappropriate that is as a mechanism of understanding the global reality of fisheries. That fish are part of an ecosystem. We just heard it again. It's about food. It's a part of something bigger. It's not just about ownership. And I want to remind you of a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Chief Dan George of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation in British Columbia. Also an actor, many of you saw him in movies, but he was a longtime chief, a philosopher, a writer, and a poet. Chief Dan George once said, "Of all the teachings we receive, this one is the most important. Nothing belongs to you. Of what there is, of what you take, you must share." Profound words that accurately describes the mentality of small-scale fisheries all around the world. Another concept that we heard a lot about in the last 3 days is about adaptation. Perhaps we were speaking about environmental determinism, but nevertheless, we were talking a lot about the environment, climate change, the impact it's having or will have, some very negative, some perhaps even positive, on small-scale fisheries around the world. At its fundamental level, wild fisheries is a hunter-gatherer activity. It's collecting from the environment without the inputs of fertilizers and interferences that are often associated with other types of activity. The environmental impact actually, in my view, comes in two ways. The first one we should recognize is the human impact on the environment and how it affects fisheries. We know about the dams on the Columbia River and other dams and other rivers all around the world. We've heard about the nuclear power plants on lake fisheries and how it's impacting and warming the water. We also heard about dams or barriers designed to prevent tidal water from moving in its natural way and how that had a significant impact on fisheries. So the human impact on the environment, in addition to all these larger issues, is something we should very much think about. In other ways, maybe more with an intent of a positive outcome, is something like salmon enhancement that's so prevalent in the Northwest Pacific, and in Japan and Russia and so on. You know, it's interesting that as we observe the great decline of wild salmon fisheries on the coast of British Columbia, Washington State, perhaps Oregon, as well as in parts of Alaska, I recently read that there may be more wild fish in the water of the North Pacific than any time in history. The reason being is stock enhancement. We are actually putting pink salmon, chum salmon in large numbers in the North Pacific. What does that mean for food supply, for sockeye, for coho, and other species? We also fish species historically from a single species approach. We create an imbalance between the different species, and we create issues. Here, an issue of significant conversation is the relationship of seals to the environment and how seals impact. Seals are traditionally harvested in indigenous cultures and very much a part of the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery for a very long time. But due to a variety of reasons that most of you know about, not so much today. And then there is the natural environmental effects. We know about climate change. We heard an excellent presentation today on the serious consequences of what it may result in. But here in Newfoundland and Labrador is an interesting place. It was here that the codfish collapsed, fishing, but the environment was significant. The Newfoundland shelf is unique. It's where the cold Labrador current and the Gulf Stream collide. It's the northern edge of many species and the southern edge of many others. It can change very quickly. We can use the expression somewhat of a canary in the coal mine in terms of what happens in the environment. We know there is a North Atlantic oscillation that changes approximately every 30 years. We know through historical records that the great decline of the 1890s may very well have been on par with the 1990s for the traditional cod stocks. It wasn't for the fact that the fishery resource was in better shape to start with. There's these things that happen to us continuously. We also know that traditional knowledge could have helped us point that out. I remember a story from my grandfather fishing. He came from Makovic in Labrador, fished on the northern tip of where I come from, Lansing Meadows. Most of you would think that's a Viking site. And he saw a mackerel for the very first time. This was in 1913. Coming from Labrador, that's not a surprise. But his future father-in-law said to him, yeah, there were lots of these here 30, 40 years ago, before the great decline of the late 1800s, but they all disappeared. And now they're starting to come back. A little signal from local knowledge, the species change, the climate changes, the weather changes, and on and on. It continues. It reminds me of rebuilding plans. We need to think about that. Grand ideas, essential that we get the maximum value and natural stocks are returned to a status that best reflects the environment. But shrimp, redfish, and cod cannot be at a high at the same time. It's like the rabbits and the foxes from elementary school. They eat each other. So we cannot expect to build all stocks to all levels. We also must come to realize that the new environment that we're in may very well reflect a new status quo, whereas a maximum can be achieved from certain resources may very well be the case. So then I got thinking about small versus big. This conversation, there was some mostly about small here, but some references to big. Definitely a source of conflict in this part of the world for sure, and I'm sure in other places as well. But what I sense is a symbiotic relationship starting to emerge. We know, for example, that the way the fishery is constructed today, that young people often fish on offshore vessels for a period of time, return to their own communities, and fish in small-scale fisheries for further time. Economically, that makes sense. It also adds in some economy of scale for marketing purposes and so on. There are some great examples of this starting to happen. We heard one today. The Maori have 30% of the fishery in New Zealand, but they also have a traditional right to fish in the coastal context. The Mi'kmaq, some of the communities, have recently acquired a major share in one of the biggest seafood companies in Atlantic Canada, Clearwater. The Coastal First Nations, I don't mean all of them, the group I'm referring to actually call themselves the Coastal First Nations in Northern British Columbia, and the Haida recently negotiated a fisheries agreement where it's interesting. Their intent is to take the offshore or the larger fisheries of British Columbia that they've acquired through that process and actually reinvest back into small-scale fisheries with multiple purposes. There's a social purpose. There's a reintroduction into the communities of fisheries that's been long lost for reasons that would take many hours to explain. But it's also training, it's interest, and it's economic activity. So they're actually taking big and making it small in order to facilitate a re-establishment of their long-established fisheries. I heard a lot about ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, really talking about knowledge co-production. And basically, that's what we've been doing for 3 days, engaged in knowledge co-production. And I think that's very, very important that we understand that there's more to knowledge than the traditional, and I don't need to say it, it's been said many times, than the traditional approach to Western science. We recognize that that is reality. And my little story about the mackerel kind of reinforces that point as well. But the one point that I really wanted to emphasize from what I heard in the last 3 days is this concept of stakeholders. What is a stakeholder? First, fundamentally valuable, the concept of sharing information and bringing all the people together with an interest, if that's what we mean by stakeholders, in fisheries, and sharing information and getting the best possible outcomes. But we should not confuse the stakeholders and rights holders are not the same thing. I think Ken described very well the distinction between what's a rights holder. Rights holders, and we know many examples that drive that process. Ken described from his world and his communities the key cases. In the United States, you had the Bolt decision. In Canada, as Ken described, we have the Constitution. We have agreements, modern treaties, historic treaties, and we often forget, but the numbered treaties. And we also have court cases. And Ken mentioned them. There's Sparrow, there's Marshall, but there's others. There's Housing, there's Healthy. And some of the big ones, Williams, and cases that deal with land ownership and fisheries in a different way. So rights holders are different from stakeholders. I would also suggest that while it's imperative that everyone get an opportunity to have input into the process, the traditional harvester here in Newfoundland and Labrador and elsewhere is not truly defined as just a stakeholder. They have a different interest, a more significant interest, they're certainly a principal stakeholder at a minimum, but I've had the opportunity to visit, sometimes with Keith, many communities in this province. I've also had the pleasure of visiting Indigenous communities in 7 Canadian provinces and a territory, and never once did any of them call themselves a stakeholder. It's something different. It doesn't mean the same thing. So I'd be cautious about terminology for sure. So finally, getting everything right. And I think it's very much reflective that it depends on where you come from, what you're talking about. So it's okay to be different. It's okay to be wrong. And it's not always necessary to get it all right. And we have a lot to learn from each other. So I'm going to conclude just one more point of that on the concept. For thousands of years, Indigenous people have been managing their own fisheries and got it right. For 500 years, starting right here, for the most part, the non-Indigenous or the settler populations have been engaged in small-scale fisheries and still are. It's still going. It's outlasted all of the other things that's happened to fisheries. So getting it right maybe sometimes is about looking back and realize what we are achieving And that's right. And finally, I'm going to end with another quote, this time from another one of my great admirers, a philosopher from the indigenous perspective, and that is Chief Sitting Bull, the great chief of the Sioux Nation in what is now the United States. Let us put our minds together and see what we can do for our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You set off the getting it right alarm in the back, so really appreciate that. So our final speaker is Dr. Paul Foley. Paul is an associate professor at the Environmental Policy Institute in the School of Science and the Environment at Memorial University of Newfoundland's Grenfell campus, which is situated in traditional Mi'kmaq territory in Corner Brook. His training is primarily in critical social science fields of political economy and political ecology. His applied research supports integrated approaches to fisheries and oceans management across ecological, economic, social, and governance dimensions. He is currently a co-investigator on the Ocean Frontier Institute Informing Governance Responses in a Changing Oceans research project, and co-principal investigator of the Future Ocean and Coastal Infrastructures Research Project. Paul is a wonderful and thoughtful person, and so let's welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Evan. Okay, I'm just going to jump right into this. So we know that the getting it right idea is a bold proposition. It's ambitious. Some might even say it's naive, but I think this conference has showed that it's probably necessary. So I'd like to briefly reflect on the getting it right idea itself, and then I'll reflect on potential next steps for getting everything right for communities, for science, and for policy, as was requested, I think, in one of the original panel descriptions. So in reflecting on getting everything right, I think we learned something about the getting part, something about the everything part, and something about the right part. So first, what did we learn about the getting part? Well, to get can be defined as to come to have or to hold something, to receive, and to succeed in attaining, achieving, or experiencing, or as obtaining. So obviously a lot of knowledge was received and even experienced perhaps over the last 3 days. On top of that, we learned that the receiving, sharing, and obtaining of knowledge needs to not only be rigorous, say from a scientific perspective, but it also needs to be ethical. It shouldn't be extractive or colonial, and should be designed to be inclusive. So this means getting our methods right, and it's not easy, right? So just when we think we got it right, we can be taught that we missed the mark and have more work to do. So any next steps I think need to be mindful of our methods, so our conduct and ethics of conduct as researchers and as collaborators, as Gerald Singh talked about this morning. Second, what did we learn about the everything? So I think one of the lessons of this Congress is that small-scale fisheries problems and opportunities are often interconnected with wider relationships, problems, and opportunities. So as the Getting Small Right Plenary made clear, many coastal and marine relationships are often thought of as too small to require broad attention, such as rural families, coastal communities, local markets, and local governance are really connected to even bigger relationships. So I think we must understand small and big relationships together, whether those are colonialism, capitalism, or other powerful political and legal institutions, or even what biologists call ecosystems. So academic researchers, and I'm one of those, often address this challenge through these larger connections with multi-concept interdisciplinary frameworks of knowledge integration. So we've heard a lot about, I think, knowledge integration at this Congress, right? So several prominent examples include ecosystem-based management frameworks, sustainability frameworks, such as the full spectrum sustainability frameworks that seek to integrate ecological, economic, social, and governance and institutional considerations. But we also heard that other ways of knowing also call for comprehensive perspectives. I didn't catch his name before he left yesterday, but the member of the Sagin Ojibwe Nation said critically, quote, "We're not going to get this right if we don't look at things in a holistic way," end quote. And Ken Paul just gave us a really nice example of a holistic perspective and cycles a viewpoint. So researchers of integrated management might have some shared perspectives on this. They're clearly from different worldviews, but there might be some commonalities. And similarly consistent with what we learned about as two-eyed seeing. So if grouped together in this context of getting everything right, I think integrative and holistic approaches might be understood as everything perspectives or everything frameworks. So to get everything right, I think next steps really should respect, build on, and support rigorous, creative, old and new everything perspectives that can bridge different ways of knowing, including scientific, harvester, vernacular, indigenous, and other ways of knowing. We need all hands on deck for this, as to use Aaron Carruthers' words from a day or two ago. Okay, what about the right in getting everything right? So I think the conference shows us that there are different ways we can even think about right. There are two types of right that come to my mind. The first way is getting things sort of, scientifically right, technically right, or even practically right, or right in just the common sense notion of how to do things. Right means sort of like effective in this way. And I know, who decides, what's effective or right in this sense requires some scrutiny, but I'll leave that for the discussion perhaps. A second meaning of right is in terms of what's right or wrong in a more ethical, moral, and value sense. So we heard a lot about equity and justice, common threads at the Congress. But this, of course, is also very challenging to figure out, right? So the step zero for getting conservation right plenary noted that while different groups may agree that conservation is a desirable goal, what it means in practice often differs based on group values, priorities, and concerns, as well as different visions for the ocean. Okay, so if we take these three together, the getting part, the everything part, and the right part, I think getting everything right is actually a useful lens to work through some of our challenges and opportunities. Okay, so what about the future and next steps? Well, in one of the documents describing this panel, it says, what might be some new trajectories to get everything right for communities, for science, and policy? First, I'd probably like to reframe the question and instead ask what might be some new trajectories to get everything right for science and policy to support communities. So putting science and policy into the service of community is a goal that many universities, elected officials, civil servants, industry, unions, civil society organizations, and indigenous communities share together, maybe in different ways, but they share that goal. So in this context, I have two suggestions. So the first is to share the findings of this Congress to as wide an audience as possible and the lessons learned. And I think the recordings of this apparently are going online. Publications are in the works, so this is a predictable academic piece of advice, so I won't spend more time on that. Second, and more deeply, I think, and related to what I said earlier, I think there's a need to support and build on the successes of large collaborative research projects like the Too Big to Ignore initiative, the Ocean Frontier Institute's Informing Governance project as well, and other projects we've heard from over the last few days across North America and the world. And I think we particularly need significant time and effort, and yes, resources, of course, to support these everything frameworks, these everything perspectives that are capable of bringing together diverse knowledge receivers and sharers from different fields, disciplines, communities, and sectors for long periods of time, decades really. And I think that was one of the themes we've recently heard. We hear a lot about the long-term challenges of supporting the next generation of harvesters, of adapting to climate change, of honoring treaties and reconciliation. I used to think 5-year projects were long. They're not nearly long enough, right? So, okay, what about policy in service of community? So I think one of the most important steps we've heard about is how to get governance right and how to get institutions right. But I would add also to how to get politics right. In my experience, it's strange, but understandable how little politics actually gets explicitly discussed in fisheries conferences. I think I understand why, right? So there are multiple reasons, some of which are linked to the collaboration that's at the heart of the research anyway. You know, government employees are not permitted to be political for very sensible and good reasons. Some non-governmental organizations will lose their legal status if they are deemed too political. And as we heard earlier, Western science was built on the fiction of apolitical objectivity. So where we do see politics, it's usually somewhat hidden in discussions about governance, values, and questions of who has power. And we've heard quite a bit about power in the background. The term politics, though, is usually seen as a pejorative or even a synonym for corruption. We need to get politics out of science or out of policy. That's usually how we hear about it. But isn't democracy political or politics? Isn't participation politics? This doesn't mean politics is bad. For me, the goal shouldn't be to get politics out of science or policy. It should be about getting the politics right and getting the principles of politics right. So in my view, the conference confirms that science and policy in service of community has to be shaped by a democratic politics, or else science and policy will remain what critics call top-down and colonial. Rick Williams pointed this out with respect to his call for the development of democratic fish harvester associations in areas where fishing individuals and interests are individualized and fragmented. Bonnie McKay talked about the significance of democratic principles for fisher cooperatives. DFO, as we know, is struggling with methods of consultation. First Nations and Indigenous groups are engaged in long-term struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. And Chris Milley talked about the importance of politics in some of these ways this morning as well. And Barb Neese briefly poignantly, but briefly reminded us about threats posed to democracy by the authoritarian far right, what I might call the wrong kind of right. Okay, anyway, to conclude, I'll try to make this a bit of a call to action, right? Because we all talk about the need for next steps. So to make meaningful headway on everything, I think, as I said, requires all hands on deck. And that means that you are needed. And where you come in, I think, is your unique ability to continue to support what we might call everything perspectives and everything frameworks that aim to put integrated or holistic knowledge and policy into service of community in ways that can understand multiple meanings of what it is to be right. And I think that there is real power in these everything projects. Maybe not a huge amount, we don't want to overstate it, but keep plugging along in them. Join them, create them, lead them, empower them, and yes, criticize them, challenge them, scrutinize them. Help them and those with power to get everything right for science, policy, and community. Whereas we heard from Kevin, I think at least help them in getting a lot less wrong. We don't have to call this political if you don't want to, but let's be honest, getting everything right and getting the future right is a deeply and fundamentally political challenge. Political in the basic sense of governing our societies and communities. Thank you.
So thank you so much for our four speakers. We tasked them with something quite different, which was, we know what you might say, so say something new too. And I think we heard some fantastic new ideas. We heard about, things like the importance of principles of adjacency, but also new legal protections to get youth into the fishery. We heard more about the importance of how fisheries help youth and how we also need to help people in fisheries in their golden years. So in a sense, we heard from Kimberly about small-scale fisheries as an essential social protection in society and a source of food. So in other words, small scale fisheries problems are society's problems. And we heard from Paul, small is about big relationships, and we need to better understand those. So getting it right from our panelists is about getting family fisheries right. We need to better understand that from individual, family, and territorial perspectives, about getting sharing right and the implications for food. And in doing that, we need to have conversations, as Paul said, about rights, ethics, and conduct. Finally, change is coming. We heard about climate change and the need for what I now will forever call the everything frameworks, because I think that sort of cuts through our expectations and preconceived notions about what integrated frameworks are. And in order to do that, we need to make sense of stuff, which is about getting the language right, shifting the lens back in time and into the future. And finally, I like what Paul said about, delving into stuff we really don't talk about enough, which is those political dimensions, because we might agree in principle that science and policy in support of communities is the ideal, which is not a new thing to be said, but Paul is questioning, how do we actually do that, and challenging us to move to action, because that's why I think many of us are all here. So I want to thank you again, panelists, for a wonderfully insightful set of talks. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere because we still have a bit of time left. And therefore, now we're going to really turn the question back to everybody in the room. And I told you, right, that I take everywhere I go from this point onward. And that's for you also have to be ready, because we also want to hear from you about what you think we need to do in getting everything right. But we have put something on the board behind. We're not going to go read it at this time, but unless we don't have anyone would like, if nobody wants to say anything, then we might go there. But I would hope, right, that because this is pretty much our last round of interaction, and I would like to invite everyone to just let us know we would like to join this, kind of like build on or add more, or whatever you like to do with these 45 minutes we have left. Let me see here. By the show of hand, just going to take 3 at a time. So we start here with Barry, then we go to Prateep, and then we go to Hekai. I feel like this is day 1 too, by the way.
I think I'd like to have an hour with each of them. But I want to focus on one small thing that Kevin mentioned. And I really like the idea of changing the idea of stakeholder to rights holder. But I'd like to point out there's 2 kinds of ways in which we give rights to harvesters. You have a right to fish, or you have a right to a fish. One is where harvesters get rights of so many kilotons, and in another case, they get a right to use 120 lobster pots. Which right do you think is the right one to use?
Kevin, do you want to respond quickly?
Working? No? Okay. Again, I think it always comes back to the same general response, and I'm not sure this is what you're expecting, but it depends. The biggest fishery in Atlantic Canada is lobster. And the access is defined simply as access with a number of traps in a specified season. Ken wouldn't always necessarily agree with that. There are other versions of that reality. But in some fisheries, for a variety of different reasons, establishing an allotment, if you will, works. We all know about the risk, putting value, the risk of transfer, and formal regimes have emerged in New Zealand, Iceland, and other parts of the world. But it also speaks to stabilization, and it gives fish harvesters an opportunity to plan their season and actually pursue other activities like going into the offshore. So I wouldn't necessarily change that. I think you need to take a serious look at what fishery, what place, and what time and make that assessment based on the circumstances that you're presented.
Thank you. Back to Prateek.
Thank you very much. Wonderful session in the last session, in fact, and I have 2 points to make. One is about the right that Paul, you talked about, and the second one is about the small and the big. I know there is an urgency to get things right. There is an inner call to see the right things prevailing and getting to the right. But at the same time, in this world that we live, not everything is right. Sometimes wrong is more meaningful than the right as well. Sometimes imperfections, as they might exist, have a lot of meaning than the right thing that we might visualize. And it is also kind of something that speaks to the politics that Paul, you also allude, all of us. Right and wrong are very, notional, and it rests in somebody's interpretation. If giving power to the community, protecting livelihoods, keeping somebody's identity, language, and territory, access, and all of those things are wrong, as may be interpreted by many other people that live outside the communities, then I would like that wrong to be more stronger and be established. So that's right for me. So right and wrong is, in many ways, needs to be debated, and what we need to preserve, what we need to achieve, may be looked at in those senses. The second point is about the small and what is small. Until a nuclear power plant shows up next door, until a big corporation shows up next door, the small is actually big, and a fishing community, the sense of being small is very comparative in that sense. And it, relates to what is happening around that particular community. So some of the points that were made also needs to be looked at from that perspective itself. When small really comes into existence is again very comparative and very relative to what is happening around. So I just wanted to make those 2 points, as we look into the future, in terms of getting
Thank
things
you.
right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clear? Yeah, stand up, please, so that they know it.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, Paul, if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by bringing politics into the analysis, or what you mean by politics.
Can get very political in here, so go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, well, I think that needs to be sort of worked out, right? I just think we've heard a lot about power, right? And people concerned with who has power, but there's not a lot of explicit, direct, and rigorous analysis of those power structures from beginning to end. That's one way to look at power. But again, power is one of these concepts that can be approached differently, right? In terms of, some people just look at the formal political institutions of national governments and DFO, but others see power as embedded in gender relations and deeper societal structures, right? So I think it's opening a big area, but what also concerns me sometimes is politics gets blamed or used as a synonym for corruption, that politics is just in the way. So I know what people mean normally, that there's sort of vested interest, backroom deals, those sorts of things. Those need to be more transparent, obviously. But I think, the risk is people lose the value of politics, of, people's interest in self-determination. That's political. So what kind of political do we want? I guess, to go back to Rob Stevenson's question, what kind of future politics of the fisheries? What should it look like?
Thank you. Keith, perhaps you can like to add something.
Yeah. When you were saying it, I was thinking, that I really believe we do need to speak, whatever, that's a small P or kind of a large P politics, but our organization, I think basically we try to amplify the voices of these inshore harvesters and fishing communities. And as a previous speaker had said, Ken talked about the, Ottawa making a lot of decisions is much more centralized now. And I think understanding the reality of what people in coastal communities are going through, I really believe that's kind of lost and separated from the decision making. And, you know, it is difficult to amplify the voices of people who live in every nook and cranny of Newfoundland and Labrador. So, you know, often what we try to do is try to kind of tell the world our story, what are important values for us and for you know, FFAW members who are fishing all around the coast, is that this is important to us. It's the reason we're here. And, you know, the way to do that for us is to be political. So, I mean, that's why I think I agree with Paul's points. I think it makes sense.
Mhm. Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? Can you just stand up, please? Okay, you got a microphone already. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, just building off the idea of the everything framework. So it sounds great to think about everything all the time. But practically, you know, we're dealing with different social and environmental crises that are arising, new climate effects every year to deal with. So how do we find that balance between kind of doing everything and also getting things done? And responding to things that may come up unexpectedly, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's for me.
Doesn't have to be everything at the same time though, right? Okay, I'm
Yeah,
helping.
no, yeah, I agree. Everything frameworks or ideas, that's a challenge, I think, for us to think more about. But, you know, if we look at ecosystem-based management frameworks, for example, DFO are trying to work through those, and Aleta Bundy and Rob Stevenson are working through those in a practical sense. And they're everything at a particular scale, right? So you can apply it to a particular region or community to consider various, you know, things like, you know, the ecosystem as well as the human dimensions. So everything, not really everything like a global, you know, or in that wide sense, right? So it is something to be worked out. And if it was an actual set of frameworks, there is, you know, different people will have a different idea of what really is considered everything. And there's going to be that challenge of exclusion, because many frameworks that might claim to be everything will leave things out, maybe not by intention, but it's a challenge, right? And the challenge of holistic and everything is just, yeah, that's a big one.
So it can actually invite us to try even harder to think about, are we missing anything by thinking everything? Do you have any?
Hi, everyone. Natasha Tamburello from ESSA out in Vancouver. I wanted to riff on this idea of thinking of everything. And I also heard some discussion yesterday about people not speaking the same language. And I want to come back to Kimberly's great presentation. Shout out to all the work you do. I've worked with a lot of youth and environmental education, and just the importance of a lived experience and trying to break down these kinds of barriers. And, you know, yeah, like not everyone can grow up in a fishing family. But I think that it's important to find ways in our institutions and the way we train the next generation to find opportunities to have them have a work experience on a fishing boat or spend time with members of a fisheries union. Because I do think, you know, we build a lot of these programs for youth, but then we sort of grow up and graduate and then feel like we're kind of done learning in a way, or, you know, we're learning in a different way. But I think, you know, nothing is going to replace spending the time with each other, even if it's a short time and even if you don't grow up that way. And I think it would be amazing if science students and fisheries students were able to have a co-op or a work experience, not in research, but, you know, on the other side of it, in the fishery, and like hearing right from the horse's mouth, you know, what's going on and the different sides of things that way. So I think that's one way that we can start to break down these barriers. And, you know, even if you don't spend the rest of your life thinking about everything at once, you have an understanding from, you know, the track that you're in of what's outside of that you bring into your specialty and your specialization. Thank you.
So thank you for that. The reason, the big picture reason that I started this was my concern about climate change. That was the big picture. And so the ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface. And if you're going to start talking about trying to tackle climate change, you've got to deal with the ocean. And my idea is to just get as many young people at the edge of the ocean as possible. And the best way to do that is to get them fishing. And so connecting that with this transformative experience of fishing and how that immediately connects a young person to what's going on in the ocean is just, it's an unmeasurable kind of thing. And what each child does with that is their own deeply personal moment. And so, as I mentioned to you, Natalie Panic became a space engineer. Some of them may become fisheries officers, or some of them may go into fishing, or some of them may become meteorologists, or some of them may figure out that key that will help us deal with climate change catastrophe. But the thing is, if we don't get them to the ocean, they're going to be on their cell phones all the time. And so somebody's got to start to do something. So that's why I started the project. So what I'm saying is that as you were developing policy recommendations that move up the chain, don't forget this ocean literacy piece and where that fits into all of this. And in fact, I have two of Paul Foley's students who are interning with Fishing for Success. And so they're probably watching right now. And so don't forget that piece, that we have to start at the beginning. So to get small right, we have to start at the beginning. Career development starts before the age of 9. And by the age of 9, you're locked in pretty much to what you want to be when you grow up. And if we're going to stop talking about getting young people interested in ocean sciences, whatever area that might be, we've got to start tackling that early on. It's too late to wait until they get to high school or university. We got to start early. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And so support that in your policy recommendations.
So
Thank you.
getting everything right would need to start getting when they are small. Those people who will be the future. I haven't heard from this side of the room yet. Anybody would like to share some thoughts? Okay, go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you. Tom Fowler, Fisheries and Oceans. I just wanted to expand on some of the recent conversation about getting the language right and how the the people who benefit from getting the language right include some of the folks such as myself that have been in the existing system for so long that I know one way of analyzing problems. I know one set of terms to describe various fishing problems, and you can get wrapped up in the language that you've learned over the years, referring to resource management techniques and referring to stocks of fisheries. There's certain language that will restrict how you look at problems. So from someone who's spent most of his recent years looking at large-scale fisheries, I find it really refreshing to think about small-scale fisheries from the perspective of fish as food, from the perspective of the need to support coastal communities and the family connection that we've been talking about. It's good to foster creativity in our solutions. So I just wanted to raise that aspect of the language that we're using. Thanks.
Thank you. So we are all, I think, have done this kind of expanding of vocabulary, right? And recognize too that certain terminologies, certain way of saying things might not be understood in the same way by everybody. So it's really an opportunity to really think about what we mean by those terms that we use, the language that we use to represent some of our, perspective. But this kind of growing what we could use in terms of our toolbox, whether it's technical or practical or communication tools. So I think that's all helping us. Did I see someone from here?
Okay, so Rick Williams, that we invited him for the first plenary session, and he sends his apologies because he had to leave before, but he sent a message. It's a bit long, so stop me. So he says, after 20 years of hard work by harvesters, organizations, and their allies, limits on vertical integration and protections for owner-operator fleets have now been given the force of law in the Atlantic inshore fisheries. This is living proof that big changes can be achieved through collective action, collaboration, and knowledge. The next focus has to be the people side of the fishery, the aging out of the baby boomer generation and the resulting transfer in ownership of perhaps 40% of our fishing enterprises at much higher enterprise values together create an existential crisis for small scale fisheries. If there are to be vibrant inshore fisheries and healthy coastal communities and First Nations, a decade from now, we need to launch a major new research policy development and collective action efforts now to address the human objectives for ecosystem management. The evidence convinces me that we have a decade at the most to turn this ship around. And there's another paragraph, I'm not gonna read it, I'm just gonna add my own opinion to. We're always focused on governance of small scale fisheries. We've talked a lot about it, but we've talked also about ocean literacy, access to benefits, transportation, education. And I think that governance should go, it's interrelated. The problem, for example, of recruitment and retention of employees in the fishery, it's related to the welfare state or to governance of everything in Canada, in the nations of Canada. So I think it's a reflection for us to go a little bit beyond the governance of small scale fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good point. Now it's governance of everything, which is now we're getting everything right, and then we're going to govern everything. And now what? Okay, so it's excellent. Can we, do we have more comments from that other side? Oh, okay. Sorry, Barb, go ahead, please.
Thanks. And thanks very much to the panel. We've covered a lot of ground here and I wasn't in every session, so I may have missed something. But to me, one of the big gaps here really is the absence of the women who work in the industry, right? And who you know, work in these communities and raise these children and do all of this work. There was some pretty major mobilization around gender and fisheries that happened here in the 1990s after the cod collapse, you know, and the development of women's fishnet and I remember the enormous effort it took to put together the funding that would allow us to bring together internationally women who were doing research on fisheries and women who fished and worked in plants and represented those women. And it's you know, there's been a very heavy focus on the harvester. There's been some talk about, you know, other groups, and certainly, you know, the other silences, I guess, that we've been trying to address is around Indigenous issues, but there are Indigenous women and there are Indigenous men, and there are gender issues still in fisheries, and that goes from DFO all the way down to, you know, the concern about children that Kimberly raised, and the absolute critical importance that we address this. I mean, when I hear Kimberly talk, what I hear is there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done and could be done by women, not just in fish plants and on fishing boats, but in terms of creating opportunities for young people to have lived experience, right? But you know, it's not, she's one person doing wonderful work. Many people, yeah, and at the same time, I'm looking at statistics on seafood processing in this province, you know, that show that the wages are appalling. They're very low, and you know, and this province has unionized plants, right? So you know, that means if the average wage is really low, then there are some of these plants where it's extremely low. And then we have temporary foreign workers now who are throughout the industry, not just here, less so here in some place than others, but you know, so we have a whole other groups who are critical to small scale fisheries and the relationship between small scale fisheries and larger scale fisheries, right? Because to me, you know, if we don't protect the rights of all of these workers and don't reflect their concerns and pay attention to them and give them space and invite them in, then I think that's a piece of the vulnerability of small scale fisheries.
Thank you. Any, you'd like to comment, Katia? Because Katia is also working on this topic. Could you start?
I don't go to add what Barbara said because she's right. But what I want to tell is that we have to think as scientists, what is our role in the society, especially for the social scientists. And I think in France, we have this debate since 5-6 years, what science brings to the society and what are the links that we have to do with the society. I know that all of us here, and there are many young people here, so that's why I try to, young scientists, it's we try to make our career by publishing and so on. It's the main objective of a lot of the people. I heard a lot of presentations. So I was wondering what we will do after. How we bring, as you say, build together, but build together, it means that we understand each other. And I am afraid we don't understand each other. Because we go to the communities, I mean, the talk of Ken before, it was quite interesting because we go to the communities, we go for a specific reason. We are looking something specific. We come back to finish our work. And then what? And then what? I don't know. Sometimes action science can be interesting. And yesterday I was in one of the sessions about food that we have this type of research. It's research action. Maybe it can be one way. I don't think that it's the only way, but what we bring, what we build with the people that we are studying, because we study these people, we study this community, how we bring the voice of these communities in visibility, how we make them visible. Do we bring this voice to the decision-making process concerning fisheries, for example, or on gender equality? It's the same. How we bring that in the public space as scientists. That's something we have to think about.
And it might be something that I would say early career scientists might want to contribute to this conversation. Just to see, do you see where we should be going when it comes to doing research?
Well, I just kind of had another comment that kind of builds, kind of like wraps up what I've heard a lot from today, but also the past couple of days. In terms of like getting everything right, I think we've really heard that we need to bring together a lot more people than are just the ones that are here present in the room, whether that's more rights holders, which we know are different than stakeholders, industry, bringing in more youth, more First Nations perspectives, more women, and more fishers, and, maybe adjusting when the timing of these conferences are that would allow for that, that's kind of hard to do when you're thinking of like school and like work terms and fishing seasons. But I think it's great that we have platforms like Zoom or like you have the replay of videos, but I also think it's really important to get those voices in the room as much as possible because, we're not only talking about people who have different perspectives, but again, like that next generation of scientists or youth who will, pave the way for the future. So I think that's important.
So this is about getting everyone together for getting everything right. Isaac, could you move the microphone to the other side of the room, please? Anytime you want to join, just let us know. Okay.
Thank you. I just will make a very quick comment because I have a taxi waiting for me and I have to go for a flight. But just wanted to share that I've been texting with Nick from the Chippewa of Nawash ever since yesterday. And he said that I could share this thought with you. And I've been sharing a lot of the reflections that have been happening in the room. typing little quotes and things. Wanted to be sure that there wasn't a negative, feeling. And I assured him that there was so much positive reflection and learning. And he said, it sounds like things are changing course and coming into port for repair instead of floundering on the open sea. He said. And I thought that was very fitting in light of everything that we're talking about here. Maybe this just, moments of reflection to pause and come into port, tweak things a little bit instead of always charging on full steam ahead, right? So I thought I would share that with you from Nick, and I'm sure they will be in touch with folks, as I will with all of you as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Nick, for those words. Of course, as we all know, right, getting everything right would mean we're stumbling along, and then we get up again, and then we do it until we get it really. Okay. Any other comments from the panel for now? Oh, Kimberly, go ahead, please.
To build on some of the things that have been coming forward about gender issues, just to remind everyone, only about 20% of professional fish harvesters are women, and then less than 2% of enterprises in Newfoundland and Labrador are owned by women. And so if I was to tell you that about any other career or any other job, you would say, oh my gosh, we've got to have targeted programming like that. We need to fix that. And, as a high school science teacher, I can tell you that we had all kinds of STEM programming that was focused at girls and young women to adjust the inequities in science and computers and technology and mathematics. For example, girls who code, sounds like girls who fish. But you don't see that happening in fisheries or fishing. And as I mentioned to you, sure, maybe only 1 to 2% of the overall population in Newfoundland and Labrador is directly involved in the fishery now. But I did point out to you that if you get a child hooked on fishing, you are going to inspire them to so many other greater things, or maybe they will be a fishing person because we need food, but they also may become a space engineer or an academic just like you, or invent the next whatever, fill in the blank, or become an artist. I don't know, but until you give them that opportunity to have that great transformative experience of fishing, it won't happen.
Thank you. When I heard what Barb said, I also heard that we are dealing with really a real issue of also wage parity and, this kind of labor issue and the women who are not being well paid. But I heard you said earlier that fishery is actually a pretty good paying job. Is that happening in the fish processor, with processes as well?
I guess I'd start to say, yeah, we've seen big increases in, I think in the past, the inshore fishery in particular was seen as some kind of a job as last resort. It wasn't what people really strive to get into. But now, people who are fishing are doing very well, generally speaking. Now, there's a big gradient, and so many mix of fisheries is not the same for everyone, but generally, the people who are on fishing boats in the last number of years are making very good incomes and gone certainly middle-class jobs, and that's what we certainly need them to be. And what Barb pointed out earlier about the progress and the gains made for those in fish processing, it has been a constant struggle. I would say that it's been really difficult to get good wages. I would say couple of things about the industry here in Newfoundland and Labrador, like Kim points out, less than 30% are women here in professional fish harvesters, but kind of shockingly, that's the highest in Canada generally. And even some of the wages for plants in Newfoundland and Labrador are higher than most places in Canada, but still lagging behind, and I would say not paid a fair enough wage, and not enough attention given to that being really good jobs. And a lot of these places are in rural areas are kind of, out of sight and out of mind. And we've challenged even on health and safety issues. If it happened here in a factory, an ammonia leak, you would have the news media would be all over it, and people didn't evacuate a building here in St. John's. But if it happens a 10-hour drive away in a community of 400 people, nobody hears about it, or it's not a news story. And often people who own and operate these factories certainly feel, they're able to hold people hostage to certain degrees because the town is so dependent on them. And, I think that dictates the way they operate sometimes. But we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that those jobs in fish processing are really good jobs. The value is in the fish. There's no reason they can't be, but we got a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So for the societal balance that Ken talked earlier, there is definitely that economic piece, but this time it has to go throughout the value chain, including all those people involved. So we have to, again, trying to get all of those in our two considerations so that we can do well. Do we have comments from anybody else? This is almost like your last round now because we almost. Okay, can we go with Madeline first? Madeline, yes, thank you.
I just wanted to comment to the young people who are doing research. It's very easy to get discouraged when you're first starting. You think you aren't making an impact, but 30 years down the road, you find suddenly that you have made an impact and that people have actually listened, and there are more people coming behind that are making more of a difference in the lives of people that you care about. And I also wanted to just speak on the issue of women. Thanks for bringing that up, Barb. In New Bedford, as I said in my talk, there are women that are in every aspect of the business. Processing is probably the worst in terms because they do rely a lot on the temporary workers, and so they don't pay them as much, either the men or the women. But in everything else, a lot of young women are inheriting the businesses from their fathers, which I think is a really fascinating change. It used to be that only the sons would inherit, but now it is the women. There are the women, whatever. That's all.
Okay, so last call for Rio. Anybody? I mean, from the floor first, of course. So Tip, you like to still say something? Because you have your hand
Just
up.
a quick point about, getting everybody involved that you were talking about, so I think the rules of the games need to change. I mean, how you involve people, young and old, everybody, is maybe not through direct interaction with the fisheries. I come from a rice and fish culture. My introduction to fish was through, trying to eat the fish at home before I got out into a fishery and kind of experienced firsthand what fisheries is, and what catching a fish could mean. With communities, fishing communities really changing, being mobile, I work in a community where, 70% of the people from some villages have migrated to big cities. But what helps them to keep in touch with the fish and the fisheries and thinking about the place is, their introduction as kids to eating fish. Wherever they live, they eat fish. So in that sense, the involvement of those people, no matter whether they become future fishers or not, or whatever they do in the cities or elsewhere, they're going to be thinking about this and maybe act as a pressure group, act as a interested group to think about fisheries, to think about fishing as a way of life for other people that their parents were part of sometimes. So there are multiple ways that exists. And more are culturally oriented and starts from the family, starts from other habits and ways of life that we have, not necessarily getting out into the fisheries and jumping into the water and catching a fish. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any final words from the panelists?
No, very, very quickly, I would just say that what I've been able to take in over the last few days has been refreshing, and knowing that there's so many people from a lot of different parts of the world and walks of life interested in, who gets access to fish, what it means to those people in the communities. And I think there's lots of work to do. And just with the FFAW, we've worked with some people, certainly in this room before, or many people, I would say. And if people are interested in following up on that work, you can certainly always contact us, whether it's around women in the fishery, around the impacts of climate change, or whatever the topic is, just say that we're certainly open to talk and partner and work with people to further our causes. Thanks.
I'll skip Paul for now. I go to Kevin.
I would echo Keith's point, very refreshing, very interesting, very good points raised across the board. It's amazing how much we're different and yet how much we are alike. It's similar issues all around North America, and we had some input from other places. And if I may speak a little bit about, family. And I know Keith and I have a very similar experience in growing up. And I would say for me, there was no boundary between family life and livelihood. All of us, mother, grandmother, grandfather, father, we all participated in the fishing enterprise as a part of a family unit. And now that's a 35-year-old thing, and the moratorium changed that, and the fishery changed. And I think the work that Kimberly is doing is so essential because of that. We have to reintroduce that to the youth, to the young people. Yeah, I think it was true in urban Newfoundland and Labrador, to the extent there's urban in Labrador, always that there was that closeness to the sea just wasn't there. But the way we grew up 35, 40 years ago in the traditional fishery of Newfoundland and Labrador, the connection between all members of the family and the family itself into the livelihood activity was very real.
Kimberly.
I think Kevin took my line. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I grew up in Newfoundland, just going down to the splitting table and pulling out fish guts, and the elders in the community who weren't related to me because I was the American kid. But they were happy to answer all my questions. And, I was asking, is that a boy fish? Is that a girl fish? And they would answer them. And I learned so much about science just standing at a splitting table with community people who were happy to be natural mentors, because that's what you did. You passed on the knowledge of the community to the next generation, because you knew that the next generation was going to fish. And that was knowledge that you needed to hand along. And so there was learning that was going on across the filleting table or the splitting table. And that doesn't happen anymore, because since the cod moratorium, that work has been industrialized and professionalized, and children can't participate in it anymore. And so they've lost that connection to the elders in their community. And so how do you reconnect everyone? And so that's what we're trying to figure out with our little nonprofit. So if you happen to be here a little longer, I hope you can wander down to Petty Harbor and see what we're up to. Thank you.
And tomorrow is a beautiful day for that. I'm going to just shift a little bit, because I'm going to keep Paul and Evan on the stage. I'm going to ask everyone to give a round of applause to our speakers. And we're gonna do a bit of a closing now. So thank you very much, all our panelists. So Paul and Evan, right? So can we get the slide? Paul and Evan are part of this whole helping with chairing of this committee to do this. And I really would like to hear, that really this is like a final closing remark from Paul and then Evan.
Thanks, Ratana. A few things. One, one thing I'd like to say is change is not linear. So I actually grew up in a fishing community. I don't think I've mentioned it yet. Tilting on Fogo Island. And there was a gap, I think in the mid 2000s till a few years ago, where there was no one from that community was fishing. There's no fisherman, no fisherwoman. No boats would dock and bring in fish. But someone came back from Halifax after being away for a while, and now there's one. I know there's at least another set of brothers that are looking for trying to get in. They face all the challenges that we've heard about. So change is not linear. Our fishing community was for a while not a fishing community, and maybe it isn't really now with maybe just one fisherman, but I think they would hope that it's still called a fishing community. So change is not linear. The other thing I'd just say is there's a lot of people in this room that are, I guess, really busy. And there's a lot of opportunities in terms of working together. I know people are, strapped for time. But as you could see through this conference in Congress and getting back together, many of you know each other. many of you are making new connections. There's a lot of opportunity to move really important projects forward, working with communities, working with partners. It can be tough because most of you don't have time. I know that. But when there's a lot of people involved, you can spread the work, and so there's power in numbers. So I'd encourage to move ahead with that idea or move ahead with that connection, recognizing the value of this kind of conference. And the last thing I would say is just I am listed as co-chair, but Evan and Ratana have been driving forces of this conference, and they deserve massive amounts of credit and deserve so much thanks for everything they've done in terms of this Congress, and I'm pretty well in awe of the kind of work and activities that they've been doing behind the scenes.
And of course, as you see in the list, there are many other people who are really part of this whole committee, and it's been a really great team effort. But really, I'm gonna give Evan now kind of close to the final words.
Yeah, penultimate, I'll say.
Penultimate.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's very kind and generous of you. And I would also include Vesna there, who there's no, bunch of flowers big enough for. So thank you very much. I want more Keith, Kevin, Kimberly, Katya, Madeline, Barb. I want more of these people in the world. And I think, getting small scale fisheries right is also going to be about getting universities right. And I think we need to really think about whether the university and how things are organized are structured in a way to foster the next generation of citizens and leaders capable of integrating problems in service of justice and sustainability for universities. And I know there's some great examples out there that we can learn from, and certainly individual mentors that I see in this room that are so fantastic, including to me, but it's not really just about individuals. And we know that based on our conversations about fisheries. So that's my final thought, other than to say, thank you so much for coming, for teaching everybody, including me and one another, and for coming to this beautiful place that I've been calling home for now just for a few years. And I really do hope to see you at the next Congress, wherever that may be, so we can see where we got in terms of action in 4 years, because I think we need to hold each other to account for some of these wonderful ideas that we have here today. So thank you again, and I will see you at the 5th World Small Scale Fisheries Congress.
In the meantime, of course, there is a SSF CAN network that would then keep working. We would keep working on and be connecting everyone into that, so that you can keep doing something, don't have to wait 4 years. So getting everybody together to getting everything right for small scale fisheries has been a great journey. And I think we all been feeling humbled and appreciative of the opportunity to be able to do this together. So I think that is from, if I could speak on behalf of the TBTI Global Foundation, which is really pushing this Congress series. And also for this particular Congress, this is Ocean Frontier Institute, Module I, and a lot of members in this room, a lot of people have been contributing to these 2 big projects, and we would continue to do the good work, and in order to really enjoy the journey together. I want us to also, I was actually hoping that our staff, our team would stand up one more time, and also the committee member, to really show that we really appreciate what we have done. So yes, thank you so much for that. Yes, I also want to acknowledge Dave and Paul. So Dave and Paul from Encore has been working really hard to help us putting this hybrid together. And our host here of the Delta Hotel, the catering people here, and all the people who have been helping us getting through this very tough program. So I really appreciate all the effort. And just like what Evan said, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And we'll see you again very soon. And I have changed the weather outside, if you haven't noticed. So please enjoy the rest of your stay and have a safe trip home.